This morning is the first in a four-part sermon series inspired by Andrew Harvey's book, A Walk with Four Spiritual Guides, Krishna, Buddha, Jesus, and Ramakrishna. I should perhaps also add that although I deeply appreciate many of Harvey's books, I don't actually think the one that I'm basing the sermon series on is a very good one, so I'm not actually recommending that to you, but I do like his framework and in borrowing that. So, and I'm looking forward to, over the next few weeks, looking at some of the insights and lessons that there might be for us today as 21st century Unitarian Universalists, considering in turn these paths and comparing and contrasting them between Krishna, Buddha, Jesus, and Ramakrishna. We point to 6 sources of what we call our living tradition: direct experience, the words and deeds of prophetic men and women, wisdom from the world's religions, Jewish and Christian teachings, humanist teachings, and earth-centered teachings. But I would wager that none of us are equally well-versed in all 6 of those. So part of my hope for this morning and over the next 3 Sundays is that we'll feel a little bit better equipped in looking at the paths and intersections of these 4 spiritual guides. So turning our attention to the first of these 4, Krishna, is from the Hindu tradition, as you heard earlier, the world's 3rd largest religion with adherents totaling approximately 900 million. By comparison, Christianity has about 2.1 billion adherents and Islam about 1.5 billion. Buddhism and Judaism are smaller with 376 million and 14 million adherents, respectively. If you're wondering, there's about 800,000 UUs in the world. Additionally, you'll perhaps note that I use the term Hindu tradition instead of Hinduism for reasons that will become clear shortly. And there's a sense in which I do intend to use this morning's topic as a way more of talking about the Hindu tradition generally than I do about talking about Krishna in particular. But to make sure this sermon title wasn't false advertising for anyone who came here for that, let me focus on Krishna, if only briefly, before I get carried away talking about the Hindu tradition more broadly. And to play on that last adverb, the Hindu tradition is indeed stunningly broad, wide, and deep. It's so widely diverse and rich that for those of us who were raised on a narrow path of Western monotheism, it can be hard to know where to start with something as rich and diverse and complex as the Hindu tradition. As one scholar jokes, where Einstein remarked that God does not play dice with the universe, the Hindu texts tell us that God, Shiva, does play dice and cheats. And given this broad, diverse religious history, Andrew Harvey wisely chose Krishna as a helpful entry point into the Hindu tradition. Krishna, according to tradition, is an incarnation or an avatar of Vishnu, and Vishnu is part of the so-called Hindu trinity of Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the sustainer, and Shiva, the destroyer. And if you're looking for an accessible entry point into the Hindu tradition, one recommended way by many is the Bhagavad Gita. The Gita, written around 100 CE, is part of a long epic poem known as the Mahabharata. And by long, I mean many, many times longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. I should also note that there are much earlier Hindu scriptures, such as the Vedas and the Upanishads, the earlier of which dates to around 1500 to 1000 BCE. And in the Gita, the charioteer in that story turns out to be the god Krishna. And that name Krishna literally means black or blue, which is why Krishna is the one you often see with blue skin in Hindu art for that reason, that it comes from his name. And the following practice is one way of entering into the Bhagavad Gita if you're not familiar with that text. Start by reading it through the first time, just as an interesting story. Who is Krishna in this text? Who is this other main character, Arjuna? How do they find themselves in this particular predicament, sitting in a chariot out on a battlefield? And then read the Gita again, identifying with Arjuna. That is, once you've figured out what your conflict is, your own spiritual struggle, use that as a framework and listen to Krishna telling you how it is with the battlefield of your life. So starting to use Krishna as a spiritual guide. And then, when you're ready, read the Gita a third time, this time identifying with Krishna. So that's one way of entering into that text, the Bhagavad Gita. But as I said earlier, the Gita, or even Krishna, is merely one small corner of the expansive, dynamic, multi-layered tapestry that is the Hindu tradition that spans at least 4 millennia. And as you may have seen in the news recently, the nature of that complex tapestry of the Hindu tradition has been hotly contested in recent decades. Most recently, a New York Times headline read, "Penguin withdraws book by American scholar of Hinduism to settle lawsuit." The book in question is The Hindus: An Alternative History by Wendy Doniger. And perhaps it's important to note that Dr. Doniger is not some fly-by-night scholar. She's the Mircea Eliade, some of you will recognize that name, as a famous mythicist who worked with myths and world religions at the University of Chicago. So Doniger is the Mircea Eliade Distinguished Service Professor of the History of Religions at the University of Chicago. In addition to earning a master's and PhD from Harvard, she has a doctor of philosophy from Oxford, just for good measure. She's published more than 30 books. And while such renown does not by any means put her beyond questioning or make her absolutely right about the Hindu tradition, it does make the destruction of her scholarship by a major publisher a very serious concern. I should add, however, that the book is only banned in India, so you can still read it if you would like in the US, although to be forewarned, it does weigh in at 800 pages. Coincidentally, Dr. Doniger has a new book being published tomorrow by Oxford University Press called On Hinduism. And I can only hope that all of this controversy leads to unprecedented book sales, though that book is 600-something pages. So do know what you're getting into. Fascinatingly, even as her new book is being pulped, that new book is already, though it's not yet published in the US, it's already in its second printing in India. So the controversy does seem to be helping her sales some. At issue is really less Doniger's scholarship and the integrity of it, and more the highly troubling Section 295A of the Indian Penal Code, which outlaws acts, quote, intended to outrage religious feelings. Acts intended to outrage religious feelings. What a terrible piece of legislation. Can you imagine if someone could sue a publisher in America every time a religious fundamentalist was outraged? Thankfully, we have this little thing called the First Amendment to our Constitution, which protects not only the free exercise of religion, but also freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. But Dr. Doniger may have the last laugh. On her side is the demonstrably pluralistic history of the Hindu tradition, and she has an ideal vehicle to demonstrate that as the editor of the Hinduism section of the forthcoming Norton Anthology of World Religions. That one weighs in at 4,000 pages, so she's just doing a part of that. That's due to be published this November, and as she said clearly, I'm selecting these texts to show the diversity of the Hindu tradition. It's not me, I'm not making this up, I'm just pointing to the diversity that's there in these texts. And people will see that Hinduism is what I say it is, which is diverse, polymorphic, multi-layered beliefs and practices. As one Washington Post article put it about this recent controversy, according to Hindu nationalists, there is one unchanging and eternal Hinduism, which just so happens to be their version of it. Doniger's alternative history, which heeds the voices of women and the Dalits, formerly known as the Untouchables, pays attention to those parts of the tradition and observes changes in the tradition over time, and shows that there are nearly as many Hinduisms as there are Hindus. It's kind of like Unitarian Universalist, right? When you get 3 UUs in a room, you have 6 opinions. To Doniger, Hinduism is a polyphonic symphony. The Hindu fundamentalists behind the lawsuit see it instead as one note played over and over again. This is not a victory. The banning of her book and the pulping of it is not a victory for Hinduism over its American despisers. It is a victory of one group of Hindus over the other. And that's precisely the dynamic that we've been exploring here on Tuesday nights in my Lost Christianities class. You'll note that it's not Lost Christianity, Lost Christianities, plural, that's the victory of one group of Christians over another, that both saw themselves as authentic followers of Jesus. So to consider the larger context, the most recent pulping of Dr. Doniger's books is part of a larger trend that goes back to the banning in India a few decades ago of Salman Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses. You may remember a little bit of controversy around that book. And continuing through to the attacks on Wendy Doniger's doctoral student, Jeffrey Kripal, who is maybe my current favorite religion scholar. He's the chair of the religion department at Rice, who wrote a brilliant psychoanalytic study of the 19th century Indian saint Ramakrishna. So we'll look at Kripal in the fourth part of this study. So what's controversial is that he brings a Freudian lens to look at this saint, and it got controversial. So, and we'll look at that again in the fourth part of this study. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm intentionally using that term Hindu tradition instead of Hinduism, because Hinduism is a particularly contested term. And I think it's helpful to know that, you know, if you're to not stumble backward into a controversy that you may not realize. So as the Harvard, and to look at again at a parallel in Christianity, Harvard historian of religion Karen King puts it this way: the beginning of Christianity is often portrayed as this ideal to which Christians should aspire and conform. Here Jesus spoke to his disciples and the gospel was preached in truth. Here the churches were formed in the power of the Spirit and Christians lived in unity and love with one another. But what actually seems to be the case is quite different. The beginning was really a time of grappling and experimentation, and the meaning of the gospel was not clear in the wake of Jesus' execution, and Christians struggled and competed in their understandings of who Jesus was. In the beginning, diversity. And that messy reality is even more true for the Hindus than for Jews and Christians. And in the face of that truth, there's a delicious boldness in Doniger's decision to name that latest 600-page book on Hinduism, even knowing that that's a contested term. As she says playfully, the name Hinduism that we now use is of recent and European construction, but it is Eurocentric to assume that when Europeans made the name, they made the game. That's not the case. They just noticed and named something about the Hindu tradition that hadn't been named in the past. Hinduism is a term that European colonialists imposed on the diversity of cultural groups around the Indus River. They said, oh, well, that must be Hinduism. But that was not what the people called themselves. And there certainly were overlapping religious practices and sensibilities there that these diverse groups shared prior to the European arrival. But instead of dividing themselves about religion, they tended to name themselves on the basis of locality, of language, of caste, of occupation, or sect. The most important takeaway, potentially, for we 21st century Unitarian Universalists is despite our well-intentioned and inclusivist goal of naming our third source, wisdom from the world's religions, there are literal and metaphorical landmines out there in the world of religious pluralism that we should be aware of to lessen our chances of repeating the past errors of European colonialism, of treating a world religion as ours to use in whatever way we want and completely on our own terms without respecting the history and the heritage of the original adherents of that faith. At the same time, the banning of Doniger's important scholarship is a reminder that we make a mistake in the opposite direction if we allow the fundamentalists to referee us in interfaith dialogue, allowing them to prevent the positive parts that can come from diverse cultures interacting. To give an ironic example of that, of the odd interplay of these dynamics, yoga, as we know it today, is arguably a product of colonialist blending of cultures. Although some of the philosophic principles of yoga do go back millennia, contemporary postural yoga, so not philosophy about yoga as oneness, but contemporary postural yoga, twisting yourself into different positions, that was actually invented in India in the 19th century. And transnational yoga is an unlikely mix of British bodybuilding and physical culture, American transcendentalism, Christian Science, neuropathy, Swedish gymnastics, the YMCA, grafted onto a rehabilitated form of postural yoga in India. Again, as is almost always the case, the truth behind the history of religious belief and practices is complex, messy, and diverse. In the beginning, diversity. To give you another example of that sort of unintended, ironic twist that life sometimes brings, Professor Doniger tells the story of how she stumbled backward into navigating some of these treacherous intercultural waters at the intersection of Hinduism and the Western world. She writes, "One of the many reasons why I took up the study of ancient Hinduism in Sanskrit as a freshman at Radcliffe in 1958 was to escape my red diaper childhood, to avoid politics, to hide in an arcane subject far, far from the far left-wing American world. My reasoning seems to have resembled that of a man who in the 1930s realized that a great war was gathering in Europe and decided to escape it by moving to a far-off place that no one had ever heard of, Iwo Jima, which ended up, of course, smack in the middle of the South Pacific theater of the war. And regarding an incident more than a decade before this current book banning in which a Hindu fundamentalist threw an egg at Wendy Doniger in the middle of a lecture, he missed. Doniger says that the Sanskrit texts cited in my lecture were written at a time of glorious sexual opening and insight, and that I have often focused precisely on those sexual parts of the text. The irony is that I have praised these texts and translated them in such a way that many people outside the Hindu tradition, people who might otherwise go on thinking that Hinduism is nothing but a caste system that mistreats the untouchables, have come to learn about it and to admire the beauty and the complexity and wisdom of the Hindu texts. To the accusation that I cited a part of the Hindu textual tradition that one Hindu had never heard of, my reply was yes, and I intend to go on doing just that." She concludes, after half a century of studying and engaging with Hinduism, I'm not about to be silenced by a few bad eggs. I should also add that my own explorations of the Hindu tradition from a progressive perspective have resulted in an experience of a much less significant extent, but an experience similar to that Doniger and Kripal had experienced, of stumbling backward into a crowd of Hindu fundamentalists. In 2012, my editor at Patheos, where my blog is hosted, invited me to review a book by an author I'd never heard of before, who I later came to discover is a Hindu fundamentalist. I wish I had known that first. And he has a rabid cohort of internet followers. And so after 3 days after my blog post went up, in those 3 days, I usually get like a comment or two. In 3 days, there were 35 mostly lengthy, paragraph after paragraph comments in response to what was a fairly innocuous blog post, but I did question some things about his point, and they didn't appreciate that. But it was clear very quickly that we were just talking in circles, so that they were making points, and I was trying to respond to them, and then they would just make the same points over and over. So I kept up for posterity those comments so people could see it for the historical record, and then I closed the comment section of that particular post. I'm a big supporter of interfaith dialogue, and Unitarian Universalists tend to do interfaith dialogue quite well. But genuine dialogue requires an openness, a vulnerability, a willingness to potentially be persuaded by your interlocutor. And the opposite of genuine dialogue is two non-intersecting monologues. You may have experienced that at some point. Two non-intersecting monologues. And engaging in that sort of debate makes me feel like I'm beating my head against a wall. The wall doesn't really get affected, but my head starts to hurt. The invitation is to find a way, not always easy and not even always possible, especially in the short run, to transcend the terms of closed debate with an open-hearted, vulnerable encounter that can unexpectedly sometimes open the heart of both yourself and the other. They drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle, and we brought